So I was watching the Great British Sewing Bee. It's like the Great British Baking Show, but for sewers. They had a challenge where they had to sew vintage patterns on vintage machines. I thought it was interesting, so I went to eBay and found all original patterns vintage for me too. Winner of the longest, most difficult to remember store name ever. I picked up this cute dress pattern from the 1930s. I hadn't seen a pattern this old before, so I grabbed a new pattern to compare. The first thing I noticed was the price. The 1930s pattern was 45 cents, and the new one was almost $20. The next thing I noticed was the size. The 1930s pattern came with size 16, and the new pattern came with 14, 16, 18, 20, and 22. And according to the pattern, a size 16 has changed too. The old size 16 had a bust and a hip at 34 and 37, whereas the modern size pattern was a 38 and 40 inches. Then I looked at what I needed to make the dress and realized that's different too. There is no mention of notions on the 1930s pattern like the new one, and clearly the 1930s pattern had a few buttons. The dimensions of the fabric have also changed. Apparently, fabric used to come in 35-inch bolts, but today the smallest that I can find is 45. The most interesting part was inside the envelope. The modern pattern has 40 steps in the instructions, and the 1930s only has 21, because back then they just assumed that you knew basic sewing knowledge. The 1930s pattern didn't call them instructions, but rather assembling and sewing guide with finishing details like sewing collar to neck edge with seam binding, and how to finish opening with underlap, and sew inside belt to skirt, which just turns out to be a long way to say how to sew a placket.